Hello, hello, you glorious undergraduates. We are today going to start the lecture on complex cognitive processes. Oh my. Whew, there's a lot to get through, so we are going to get started right away. There are cognitive processes, thinking processes, if you will, that go way beyond just understanding the information or content that you're currently studying. A level above that, if you will, right? So, some examples are metacognition, self-regulation, transfer, problem-solving, creativity, and critical thinking. We are gonna move right along real quick. Let's go. Okay, so let's talk metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about thinking, which we often define as an awareness and understanding of one's own thought processes. So, if you've ever thought to yourself, for example, when I'm trying to learn new vocabulary words, I often find it beneficial to make flashcards and to quiz myself with those flashcards, because seeing the word and then seeing what it means together really helps me as a visual learner. You see, this thing I'm doing right now is metacognition. I'm thinking about my own study processes and thought processes, which, yay, is basically what metacognition is. The way that helps our students learn is that kind of self-awareness is very useful to them when they plan out how to study, how to tackle a new problem, how to think critically about something that's going on. Being aware of how their brain functions helps them find the best way to get to the information or the understanding that they want to get to. Okay, so metacognition has to do with your own knowledge and beliefs about how your mind works. It also has to do with the behaviors that you do that increase learning and memory. So, you think about, like, what is thinking? What is learning? What are my limits there? Like, how much can I really learn in a day? How much can my memory store? That sort of thing. You think realistically about what you can get done within a certain time period. Like, I'm not going to write a 15-page paper in a day. I mean, I probably could if I wanted to not eat, sleep, or be a human. But I also know my limitations, and that, maybe 5-6 pages in a day is about it for me, right? Planning a reasonable approach to learning a task. Sometimes you think grand and glorious things like, oh, I'm going to make flashcards and they're going to be beautiful and I'm going to have the most immaculate notes. Okay, maybe that's not you though, right? Maybe there's some other way. Maybe you like a Quizlet instead of, written flashcards. I don't know. And then being able to, once you realize what works for you as a learner, use effective strategies for learning and for remembering things. This also requires some reflection. For example, if I didn't do so well on a quiz, I may look back at what I tried to do to learn the material and say, that didn't really work for me. That thing where I was just like, for example, reading over my notes didn't really work for me. I might want to do something different this time. All of these things are good examples of what we're talking about when we mention metacognition. Right? So I love this little example. It's very cute. It's metacognition in a really colorful and really cute kind of way. Like, students would have one of these at their desks, and then they might have a little something, a little token or a little bingo chip or something that they could put on whichever one of these is most relatable to them in the moment. Like, let's say I had just taught you how to do a new kind of problem in math class, and I wanted to check, as the educator, how everybody was feeling about it. Like, do you get it? Do you not get it? but I didn't want to call anybody out or like make anybody feel weird or noticed in a bad way. I would be like, okay, so, check-in time. Please put the little chip or whatever it is I got you using on whichever one of these little dudes best describes how you're feeling in the moment. Like, is this crystal clear? Do you totally get it? Maybe it's, but oh gosh, once you start getting here, it's like, yikes, I don't know if I get this. And this one is, I am confused, please help me, right? So it's a cool little way for students to show their teacher, like, how they're feeling about new information, which is super cute. And maybe at first you would not look at this and go, oh my gosh, that's metacognition, but it totally is. Because you've got the students thinking about how they're processing material and, like, to what extent they're processing that material and learning it. It's a cute little idea. I hope some of you will consider this if you ever work in a classroom. Okay, so the next thing is self-regulation. And self-regulation sounds a lot like emotional regulation, which it kind of is, but it's that, but for the way you interact with thinking and learning, not just your feelings, right? So usually when we talk about self-regulation, we're talking about being able to calm down when something doesn't go our way, or, being able to come back to normal when our feelings are out of kilter somehow. But when we're talking about it in education, we're really talking about being self-directed, and being kind of independent in your learning. So, evaluating the difficulty of something that's given to you, looking at it and going, all right, well, this seems like this is pretty tough stuff, so I better really lock in on this. I better study extra for this. Or things like planning, like knowing how much time you're going to need, how much work you're going to have to do, staying focused. And then, it all comes back to reflection on some level, the evaluation or the monitoring of that plan's effectiveness. Like, I made this plan, I did the thing, did it work, yes or no? And if it didn't, where did it not work? Is very important. So they give you some strategies there, some reflections, some questioning, and that sort of thing. Okay, so here are some ways you can see a self-regulating learner and know that that's what they're doing, right? So they've established goals, they've made plans, they are both controlling and monitoring what they're doing as they do it. They try to control both their motivation and emotions, which is easier said than done, but it's a thing we want everybody to learn to do. They ask for help when they need it. Okay, when we say self-regulating and self-determined, we are not saying so independent that you refuse to ask for help when you need it. Okay, that is counterproductive. It is bad, both in education and in life, to go, let me just suffer and struggle and try to be so independent when I could ease my suffering by asking for some help. Right? We want you to ask for help. We want all students to ask for help all the time. And then another thing they put is to self-impose consequences for your performance. So, if you didn't do as well as you hoped you would, then maybe you don't get to play video games tonight. Maybe you have to continue finishing your work instead of spending time playing the video games. Maybe you were planning on going to a party, but you didn't get as much done today as you thought you would, and maybe it was your fault because you were kind of slacking, so maybe you either don't go to the party or you show up late. I don't know, I kind of hate that example now that I'm saying it, because I think you should socialize and have fun. But you get the idea, right? So, little kids, not super self-regulating. They need a lot of prompts, they need a lot of hand-holding, they need a lot of help with these things, right? They may not even know how to get assistance yet. So as you grow and as you become an older, more experienced learner, you get generally better and better at these things. Right? So here are some, a little breakdown of the components of self-regulated behavior. You have self-determined goals and standards, right? Nobody else gave them to you. You came up with them. Self-monitoring. No one else is doing it for you. No one else is keeping you on task. Okay. Self-instructions, like, you're guiding your own learning. You're telling yourself how to do it. Self-evaluation, in which you look and you go, hey, did I do a good job or no? Did I do a sort of good job or no? And then self-imposed contingencies. So, you have your own ways of dealing with the outcome, whether it was success or failure. Okay, so let's talk a bit about knowledge. We love to talk about knowledge transfer in education. And that just means you take something that you learned in the past and bring it into a new context and use it, right? Teachers love this. Let's be real. We love it when we teach you something and then you go somewhere else in your life and you use that thing we taught you. Even if it's just, you learned about something in a history class that you then use later on in a debate in a different class. We love that stuff, right? So please tell us if you ever do that. It's very cool. But that's what transfer is. It's taking knowledge from one place that you learned it and using it somewhere else in your life or in your academic career. So there are a couple of different types of knowledge. Declarative is what I think most people probably think about when they say knowledge. It's the what and the why, the facts, the figures. It's content, basically. So a lot of what you learn to do in classes that is content-based will fall under that category. Procedural knowledge is how to. So it's not... Okay, let's take milkshakes, for example. Knowing what a milkshake is and what it's made of, that would be declarative knowledge, right? But knowing how to make a milkshake, the steps that are involved in making a milkshake and being able to do it yourself, that's procedural knowledge, right? And then we also have conditional knowledge. That's you figuring out which situation to use the knowledge in, basically. So also transfer is a kind of conditional knowledge, right? So we have these knowledges, but then if we take that a step further into metacognition, declarative knowledge becomes knowing what strategy to use in a certain situation. Let's say that I give you a Spanish verb, and I tell you to conjugate it in the past tense. Okay? Declarative knowledge would be you knowing what strategy to use, right? Let's take that example a little deeper. Let's say I've given you a sentence in Spanish. I wanted to buy the candy, for example. And I tell you to go ahead and translate that thing into English, for example. So knowing what strategy to use to attack that sentence, that would be your metacognition in a declarative knowledge kind of way. Knowing that you should probably, for example, write down the words that you already know and maybe look up the ones you don't know, and then you got to figure out how to conjugate this verb. Knowing that that's what you're going to have to do would be declarative knowledge. Okay, so now that you've got all that declarative knowledge, you're going to move into the procedural knowledge, right? So how do you use those things that you've already done in this lovely little context, right? So, I know how to conjugate that verb wanted in the past tense. So then you would go through it and you'd be like, okay, let me conjugate this verb. Let me do it right. That would be in the procedural knowledge category. And then conditional knowledge would be knowing when and why to use it. Why are we using that particular form of the past tense for this verb today? Well, because the sentence was, I wanted, right? Which is past tense. Okay? So, this would be a good time for you to use the past tense. So knowing when and why to use it in that case would be conditional knowledge. We're going to go back to transfer for a second. Transfer comes in many different forms. We're going to talk about 4 specifically. Please keep in mind that transfer is taking knowledge from one context and using it in a different one. So there's positive transfer. So you learned a thing, and then at one point in time, and then later on, that thing either facilitates your learning or your performance at a different time. So you learned it, and then later on it ends up helping you somehow as you're learning something else. That's what we call a positive transfer. That happens a lot with, I'm going to use a language example. That happens a lot with learning new words, let's say in Spanish, because you might have already learned, for example, that a word that ends in like AR is a verb. Yeah. So you may see a new word you've never seen before later on and try to figure out what it means. Okay, well, it ends in an AR, so that tells you from what you already knew that it's probably a verb, which will help you start really kind of taking in what could this be. All right, it's an action. I know that. And then maybe the rest of the context of the sentence will help you figure out what that action is. That would be an example of a positive transfer. However, there's also negative transfers. Sometimes you learn a thing that's very helpful in that moment, and then later on it interferes or messes with learning or performing something else at a later date. Another language example for you would be learning a word and then later you come across a different scenario where you think you can use that word, but you honestly can't, right? So one of the things we talk about in world languages classes is transfer between languages, right? So you may take a word from Spanish and put it into English in a place where it doesn't fit, or vice versa, right? Your understanding of how English works sometimes interferes or messes with your understanding of how Spanish works. So, in Spanish, we like to do that thing where we put a describing word after the word it describes. Like, instead of, like in English, orange pumpkin, in Spanish, we usually say pumpkin orange, right? Your understanding of how English works, describing word goes first, orange, and then the thing it describes goes second, pumpkin, might make you mess that up in Spanish later on. You're writing a Spanish sentence or you're saying a Spanish sentence, and instead of saying pumpkin orange, which is correct in Spanish, you would say orange pumpkin, because that's your English knowledge coming out, right? That is an example of a negative transfer. It's something you learned in the past, but doesn't work in the context of the thing you're learning now. A specific transfer is where the first task that you learned and the transfer task sort of overlap in a content. They sort of work together, right? Which is always a beautiful thing. We love it when that happens. So maybe something from the original task works for you in the new context. And that would be a specific transfer. And then a general transfer is like, okay, the original task that you learned and then the transfer task, the other task, are like different, content-wise. I like this picture of the dog. He's really cute. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, though. We're going to keep moving because this video is about to get long. All right. So problem solving, creativity, and critical thinking, my favorite things in the world as a person who studies argumentation. Problem solving is, of course, using the knowledge you have to answer a question or fix a situation that's not working out for you, right? We got a couple of kinds of thinking that fall under that category. Convergent thinking is pulling a whole bunch of information together to come to a way to solve the problem, right? So you take a whole bunch of things and you put it all together to make one solution. That is convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is kind of the opposite of that. You have a single idea that you start with, and then you branch out in multiple different directions with that idea. Right? So, in the first one, you take a bunch of things from a bunch of places and you make one solution. And in the second one, you might have had an idea what the solution is, but from there, you move in a bunch of different directions until you come up with, maybe possibly a few different solutions to your problem. Education loves to talk about creativity, and there's a lot of different perspectives on what it means. As long as it's just new and original behavior that gives you a productive and culturally appropriate result, that counts as creativity. We're not thinking about artistic style creativity when we say that. And then here's the definition of critical thinking I like: evaluating the accuracy, credibility, and worth of information and lines of reasoning. So, you may hear an argument and you may think, this sounds a little bit not true. I need to think about this. I need to look up some things. I need to check out some evidence and see if this is in fact true. Is it coming from a good source? That's credibility. Is it logical, right? All of that sort of falls under the category of critical thinking. We have some different forms of critical thinking. I won't spend a ton of time on this. Verbal reasoning is just understanding and being able to weigh and think about the way that we try to persuade each other with language. So deductive and inductive logic are examples of this. And then there's argument analysis, which someone may give you reasons for why they're supporting a claim or an argument, and you choosing, does that make sense or not? Like, do these reasons actually support that claim, or do they not? And then there's probabilistic reasoning, in which you determine the likelihood of something actually happening, right? Like if I told you that, if you don't go out and vote in the 2024 election, whoever becomes the next president will probably start a nuclear war. Okay, the likelihood of that is fairly low. At least I hope it would be. So using your probabilistic reasoning, you could determine that, like, I might be exaggerating there, that claim might be crazy and not at all credible. Excuse me. And then hypothesis testing. You come up with a theory or a hypothesis about what you think is going on. You take a look at the data, any research that may exist, and then decide, does it make sense? Is it relevant? Does it not necessarily prove my hypothesis, but does it, support my hypothesis? Okay, so, when we talk about levels of thinking in education, we talk about higher order thinking and lower order thinking. We've called that HOTS versus LOTS here. If that helps you remember it, great. Higher order thinking just means that some kinds of learning require more processing power from your brain than others do, right? But also those tend to have generalized benefits. Like take critical thinking, for example. That's considered higher order thinking. It's hard to do, right? It's very difficult. Takes a lot of brain power. But you can use critical thinking in a whole lot of different scenarios. So the benefits are more generalized. They work in a lot of different contexts if you're a person who's good at critical thinking. Lower order thinking skills are kind of the bottom of the pyramid. You have to have them in order to be able to get to the higher order thinking skills. But they typically tend to be things more like, just knowing content or rote memory, being able to regurgitate information, but not really do anything with it or apply it, basically. So we have on the side here some verbs, and it wants you to sort them from lowest order to highest order. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you create is pretty high. It's pretty high. That's a high one. Describe? Not so much. That's you just telling what something is. That's very much a lower order thinking skill, right? I'm not going to tell you the other ones. I'm going to let you have a moment or two to think about that for yourself. Feel free to pause if you want to think about it. But just so you know, describe is kind of the lower end and create is really the higher end. Because creating takes a lot more brain power than describing does. Mercy. Here we go. I love it when things are colorful like this, right? So, some lower order thinking things. Define, describe, demonstrate, compare and contrast. Right, this is the order it should go in from before. Define, very low. Not so hard. Describe, a little harder, right? Demonstrate, okay, now we're moving up the ladder a bit. That's a bit harder. You can tell me what something is, you can describe what it's like, but if you can show me how to do it, that's a higher level of thinking. Comparing and contrasting one thing and another. Moving up to judging, deciding if something is good or useful or healthy is even higher than that, and then creating is very high on that list, right? So these lovely charts here can help you see some of the activities that would fall under each category, right? Or some of the words, sorry, didn't mean to do that, that would correspond to each one, right? So if remembering, we're doing things like recognizing, just listing, naming, identifying. If we're doing creating, we're designing, we're constructing, we're inventing, we're devising. And these are just the words we use to describe what's happening, right, in each of those orders of thinking. Here's a very, very, very involved sort of wheel that shows you sort of these different categories of thinking, right? So here's some things that would fall under remembering and understanding. And also some tools that teachers use, some of which you may remember from your classes, that could be used to help students do things that fall under the category of remembering and understanding, right? And then we have it also for creating. Here are the words that we associate with it. Here are some activities we might do with it. And then here are some, admittedly some of these are way out of date by now, some things that students might use or do in terms of technology that would fall under this category, right? So feel free to take a look at that on your own time. We're not going to go through every category. Okay, so let's talk Bloom's taxonomy for a second. Bloom came up with, and he's one of the theorists you can talk about for your poster, he came up with this idea, basically, of how, like, these higher order levels of thinking are kind of organized. So let me see if I can. Right? So, I mean, we're not going to spend a ton of time on Bloom's taxonomy, but if you want to click on that link and take a look at it, that would be very important. Most teachers are taught when we're planning lessons to think of it in terms of Bloom's taxonomy and to make sure that our lessons aren't like always down here in the lower order thinking category, but that some of it gets up here too. So that we're not just having our students regurgitate knowledge, but we're actually having them use it and apply it in ways that encourage them to think a little harder, right? And depth of knowledge is another concept that really goes along with Bloom's taxonomy, but I'll let you explore those on your own. All right. We're going to skip this part. Right. So, big ideas that we want you to take away from this chapter. If you are an effective learner, if you're really good at learning, then you are regularly doing the following things. You're reflecting on, taking charge of, and striving to improve your learning efforts. If someone is a really effective learner, they're never satisfied with just doing the bare minimum in terms of trying to learn more. Like, they're always trying to learn better and more and deeper, right? So critical thinking requires you to understand the nature of knowledge, and it also requires the willingness, or we said disposition here, to scrutinize and evaluate new information and ideas. I beg of you, please do not take every piece of new information that someone throws at you as gospel, as the goodness, honest truth, and it totally has to be right. Employ your critical thinking skills. Evaluate that information. Is it coming from a good place? Is it coming from someone who should know? Does it make sense? Is it verifiable? Please do these things before you just sort of take in new information and decide it's true, right? All right, so effective teachers. We've been talking about learners so far, but let's talk about teachers. Effective teachers will foster this kind of thinking, this metacognitive thinking about thinking. And that looks different depending on what age group you're working with. You're not going to have kindergartners writing reflections on the quiz they just took and how they approached the quiz they just took. But you might do that for later grades, right? Effective teachers will also create conditions in their classroom that allow students to be flexible, to think critically, and to apply the information that they've learned in class. Not just, regurgitate it, but actually be able to use it in a practical way, right? And then the last thing we want you to remember from this chapter is that learners are better at creative thinking and problem solving if they have a fund of knowledge, a big fund of knowledge to draw from, and if they also have flexibility to make informed decisions in life. Not just in school, but in life, you need a lot of info. You just do. Let's say you're buying a car. Here's a great example. You're going to buy a car, right? Ideally, you would have done quite a bit of research before you decide which car to buy. And some of you maybe just look at a car and think, hey, that's cool, I want one of those. That's fine. But if you were really being an effective learner and an effective problem solver in that situation, you might learn some things like, how many miles to the gallon does this thing get? How gas efficient is it? What's the safety rating on these things? Like, if I get in an accident, am I screwed? Am I in trouble? Or is it a fairly safe car? What's the going price for these cars? Like, are they trying to sell me this car for too much money? Like, could I get it cheaper? These are the sorts of things, right? Background knowledge that you would need in order to make a real serious, decision, like buying a car or something like that. And also the ability to think flexibly, right? Like, maybe the car you thought you wanted is a little bit out of your price range. So, now you gotta reconsider. You have to be willing to go back to the drawing board and start over and think through the thing again and possibly come up with a new solution. Those things are so important to real, serious, deep learning as you move through your academic career. As any student moves through their academic career. Okay, so that was an awful lot of talking. This video is going to be super long. So all I need for you to do this week is make sure you're keeping up with the lectures and keeping up with the reading guides. And also don't forget to check the assignment on learning theorists. There's a video about that too. All right, I think that's it. I hope y'all are having an excellent week. Best of luck to you as you go through this EDC 312 journey.